Hi, everyone. Welcome to this very special conversation today with Professor Uma Chakravarti. And we are going to talk about feminist histories and the women's movement in contemporary India. I'm very quickly going to introduce our illustrious speaker, who really needs no introduction. She is an Indian historian and filmmaker, as most of you would be aware. Beginning in the 1980s, Chakravarti wrote extensively on Indian history, highlighting issues relating to gender, caste, and class, and published seven books over the course of her career. Her body of work mostly focused on the history of Buddhism and that of ancient and 19th century India, as well as on gender and caste. She published her first book, Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism, as a part of a doctoral study in 1987, and her subsequent writings, the most successful of which are Rewriting History, The Life and Times of Pandita Ramabai, and Gendering Caste Through a Feminist Lens, have been well received by both the audience and fellow academic scholars. Chakravarti has also directed four documentary films: A Quiet Little Entry, Fragments of a Past, Ek Inkilab or Aya, Lucknow 1920 to 1949, and Prison Diaries, all of which focus on, among other issues, women's history in India. I'm going to stop the introduction here because otherwise I can continue at least for an hour doing that. And thank Professor Chakravarti for joining this conversation today. We are doing sociology, are very elated to have you. So thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for asking me to speak to an audience. And let me put the record straight. uh, 8 films, not four, ninth in the making, and a 10th that perhaps will cap the whole thing. Okay.
Okay. And thank you so much for that. And perhaps should have done more research in terms of getting the facts correct. And thank you so much. So let me begin by asking you about your involvement in writing about women's issues. And you've been doing that for a long time now. But can we understand the transitions that are taking place in women's history writing in India at this point? Or is it, too premature to just assume that there have been transitions?
Well, to begin with, I think not sure that we can mark the moment when uh, feminists began to rewrite history in India, uh, and that there was a substantial body of historians that we could name as well. Yeah, this group of women has been writing um, on gender, uh, or they've been introducing expanding ways in which we can understand women's history. Uh, I think that's a moment which is difficult to mark, but we have perhaps we can mark the time when we began to feel that the history that has been written uh, has been, one-sided. I think Gerda Lerner put it very well. She said, when you see with one eye, you see something. When you see with the second eye, you see, and you open up the second eye, you see another. But when you open both eyes, then you actually see in the round. I mean, you see all around your eyes, right from the left to the right, and it's much more holistic. Now, that's a moment which is very difficult to identify in Indian history. Um, and there isn't enough, in my opinion, um, there aren't enough historians seriously engaging with gendered approach to the writing of history. By and large, I think people who were interested in social history um, began to feel the need for um, meaningfully incorporating women into history. And it's been a long journey. It hasn't been easy. It's been very difficult um, because partly because um, the approach to thinking about women's history took a long time to be articulated. And it is to be, in a sense, it's marking the moment. It is marked by the moment when we begin to see history as being too narrow if it focuses on the historical themes um, that history often uh, dwelt on, which meant political power. If history is the was originally seen to be the history of power and how it was continuously challenged and rewritten, uh, then in that history, it was absolutely, it was, an approach which will allow you to think about women. And there was not much point in doing that kind of history, because you'd be then saying, well, there are so few women in history because there are so few women who wielded power, and power outside in society, in the world itself, not just um, not just within the domain of home and field, or whatever it is, the immediate surroundings of women. Now that's a that realization itself, that history is too narrow in its focus. In that journey, there were a lot of people. I mean, women uh, women historians did lead the battle on that front, or the struggle on that front. But there were also other sections of people who felt that their histories were not represented in the older form of history, in which you told the history of dynasties, of the rise and fall of political power. And it was narrowly focused on political power. It was not really even inclusive of large social changes that would come. I mean, history, especially in the history of South Asia, as written by the early historians, mostly colonial, and thereafter also for a fairly long period of time, was too narrowly focused on this whole story of um, politics. Politics defined history, the political power, the capture and use of and control of power was seen as the proper field of history. And obviously, that's not an approach in which you could actually bring people into it. The moment you started to bring people into it, and there was a challenge that came from other sections, the let's put it as in the history of more a history that was rooted in, say, for instance, in 1956, Kosambi wrote a brilliant book on Indian history, early Indian history. Um, and he said, he transformed the basis of looking at history, and he brought social formations in, and he brought people into it, in people in the sense of those who both wielded power but were also subjected to power, uh, as an approach. And then there were many other historians who did that kind of thing. That opened the field up to looking at history not in a narrow sense of dynastic control or control over politics at the center, but at least allowed for um, uh, large social processes to be incorporated into history. Now, when you do that, to some extent, you would have to bring people into it. When you bring people into it, the sources force you to, which are biased, uh, force you to engage or write a history which is still too narrow, because the archive does not include the voices of common people, and it does not include the voices of women. Since women were excluded from wielding political power, the archive itself, which reflects only political power, uh, would not include women, because women were not seen as agents of transformation, or either who wielded power or who were involved in processes of challenging power, say, maybe. Okay. Now, this would mean that it would be impossible to bring women in, because even the archive would not reflect women. I'll give you an example. If you start off with something like Ashoka's inscriptions, that's among the first earliest pieces of written texts that we have inscribed in stone. They are the presentations of the king who's speaking to his people. It's admittedly the king speaking to his people. He has the resources to put himself down in history and to put what he did and what he thinks should be the proper role of governance into history, because he's left the archive for his own time. Okay, you get it? Yeah. Now, that's not something that you're going to get from women, because, or you're going to get from the underclass, from the laborer, from the subalterns, from the sections, from the Adivasis, from the tribals. And I'll give you the best example would be that Ashoka speaks of the war against Kalinga, but the Kalingans don't speak about the assault on them. There's no way we know about the how human beings experienced that assault. We also don't know, and the best example would be again from the famous Kalinga inscription, or the that we also know that the king regretted the massacre of people. The king also talks about the fact that he brought large sections of he brought back prisoners of war, and and then we may that's what he tells us. He doesn't tell us about the devastation experienced by the people in their own words, because they have not left their records behind. If you see what I mean, are you getting it? Because it's a process. It's a top-down uh, text. It's not a text in which the Kalingans are speaking. It's where the king is speaking. So in that kind of history, it's very difficult to get a sense of the bottom sections of society. How are they speaking? What are they feeling? What do they think of the war that was assaulted upon them? How do they understand it? And what is it that they tell as a story of death and devastation, right? So the archive, to that extent, is, we must understand that the archive itself is biased, and it's biased in favor of those who rule, those who are in positions of power. And so, until you get to, let's say, a time when you may have a print revolution, when democratic processes of recording and writing and dissemination uh, takes on a new possibility, which happens roughly in the 19th century, you are not going to get the voices of people as they experience their own histories, or they experience the changes that are taking place in and around them, so in a sense, I think what we need to see is, in the context of history particularly, that it's a very late phenomenon, that women can become the subjects of history, because women's speech and women's thinking, women's writing, women's um, reflections, there is no record of it till we get to a time when they can actually the publishing revolution takes place, and they can begin to speak to their a larger constituency in and around them. Okay, so to that extent, I think, okay, so that's one challenge. That's one of the concerns that you do have. Now, so now the point is that um, the nobody thought very seriously about challenging the paradigms, because it was being written. Yes, they expanded the field fairly. Social and economic history began to be written in a certain kind of way. Uh, there was there was you know same and people were reflected in history as agents quite often. I mean, there was a whole way in which you write the history of revolutions, uh, write the history of class struggle. You might write the history of those were expanding possibilities as far as expanding the um, scope of history to a larger field. Um, But even that is something that did not automatically include the what women thought or wrote about the changes that were happening in their own times. You might find it in literature to some extent, but there was hardly anyone who wrote formal histories in their own time, of recorded history in their own time. So, in a sense, the field remained, and to some extent, that was true also of the working classes, of the underclass, of peasants, and so on. They didn't write their own histories, and so at the end of the day, you were left with what others said about them rather than what they themselves were feeling about their own times and the manner in which, say, revolution impacted them, for instance. That's not something that was a thing. You get an early sense of that in the French Revolution when the Declaration of the Rights of Man are announced. And it's announced and it's admittedly called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And Olympia de Gouges has to challenge that in the 1789 or early 1790s, when she writes a mirror reflection of the rights of man. She brings in the rights of women, and she has to do that. It is a woman who has to speak and say what the French Revolution means when you're talking about the liberty for all. Yeah, what it would mean for a woman would be very different from what it would mean for a man, and they had presumed that woman is included in man, as it were, without looking at it. So, in that sense, I think what we inherited was, in any case, a skewed framework. It was not a framework which was inclusive of. So you might write his social history, but that social history was still very much dominated by the history of men. Now, in India and across the world, I suppose, basically the 1960s, late 1960s and onwards, became the point at which, with the women's movement, which this phase of the women's movement, with what might be called the feminist turn in movements, we begin to see for the first time a sort of ways in which you would go back and start to write histories now, and these histories would be focused on women. So it was like it was like compensatory history. There was a history of men, and then you did a compensatory history of women, which too was not, which is better than nothing, but which too was not enough in a sense of writing good history. Good history should be inclusive of all categories of people, and that took a long time, for which you needed to also even tweak the very paradigms of history would have to be somewhat changed. You couldn't politics could not be the only focus of history. It would have to be much wider than that, So it's at that time, and in India, to late 60s, you begin to see it in say in England and America and so on, and we begin to see it in the early 80s over here. It is a consequence of the women's movement, which itself you could trace to early 80s, late 70s. Late 70s, early 80s is really where you would put it down. So then it's after that I think this concern about a history that includes the history of women was foregrounded as an issue. But even then, there were not too many takers. And as I said, part of the challenge was because there was the archive is biased. So it's not easy to do women's history because you don't really get references. I can't, it's a kind of add-on approach. So you might, the medieval times, there'll be some moments when, say, for instance, there might be a woman chronicler, and you might focus on what she's saying. But it was very difficult to write histories of women because the archive is so terribly biased.
Right. And, thank you for that response. One more very broad question for you. We see a lot of new gender-based issues and challenges today as times have also changed. So, how do you see the role of the women's movement in the contemporary context?
Well, the, the role of the women's movement. Well, it's certainly uh, uh, brought in the need to broaden the base of scholarship, to be genuinely reflective and inclusive of women and their experiences. And as I said, it is also expanded to other categories of margins. Uh, it will be equally, so it's a process that has gone along with, say, for instance, the Dalit view of history, or bringing in um laboring history, other categories of people who were not normally written about in the past, and certainly did not speak in the archive. They may have been written about by the official records, but they would not be, it would be rare to find, say, for instance, the tracts of some coolie. Yeah, and there were some examples of it. People who were migrated, or forcibly migrated, or migrated to the colonies, say from places like Bihar and so on a extraordinary occasion, and I'm not even sure there are many examples of that. They might actually leave a record behind of their but that they had authored. But it was rare. That was kind of rare. So the archive tends to be still reflective of the dominant, but at the end of the day, the challenge has come to find new sources, to find other tracts and so on. I think the women's movement cleared the space for that kind of thing. And I do remember, and issues that were significant from the point of view of women um, were not even perceived as the proper domain of historical thinking. Uh, and it was my own work, for instance, I had on Buddhism. I had written a whole book on the social dimensions of early Buddhism, and I had only 6 pages on women. So it was like, in that entire book. So we were all, uh, and I'm I was writing in the late 1970s and early 80s. So I wrote that book at that point of time. So we were all, uh, the uh, official handling of history um, did not actually ask you to do that kind of thing. But it is the women's movement that did create the first. I think I wrote my first a small piece on the multiple versions of Sita as a consequence of the challenges posed by the women's movement and the questions raised by them about what is there in our culture that that allows a girl, or determines that a girl who's married and goes off to her husband's house should never again return to her parental home. Not even her corpse should come back over there. Basically, she should. And it was younger generation of young women who were protesting dowry uh, violence. One of them came up to me and said, "You're studying history. You've written about early Indian history and culture. Tell us uh, what there is in our past uh, that says that 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 a woman cannot return to her parental home. She will not even be taken back to her parental home." And I was told in no uncertain words that could stop coming to demonstrations, and I should instead write about why our culture is made up the way it is. So it's definitely the moment that when you're charged by the immediate environment to respond to the questions of the status and exploitation and condition of women, the violence against women, that in a sense led to broadening the field. And I wrote my first essay on the various versions of the Sita. It's a very historical piece of writing because I was able to track the manner in which the story of Sita and her oppressions becomes uh, expands and gets worse and worse, or there's a there is a narrative thread to the manner in which the story of Sita is developed in the multiple versions of the Ramayana, so that ultimately when we see the storyline as it's widely circulating amongst in people's consciousness, it is much more problematic in its in its message than it was in the early versions of the Mahabharata. I'm sorry, of the Ramayana. So, for instance, the Pali text does not refer, has a totally different storyline on the Ramayana, and the Tulsi version too does not have necessarily have it in its congealed form. For instance, I found that the Lakshman Rekha doesn't even exist in the narrative at all. It is a later imposition that comes from popular culture and is not there in the textual tradition, that the boundary is put around women. So, that's the kind of uh, impetus to the. Now, this was only one piece of writing, but then there were many, many others who came on and researched with a specific gender eye, as it were, uh, brought in the perspective of including women and their experience. So there are, for instance, there are sources, but they've hardly been paid much attention to. For instance, women have donated grants, have facilitated inscriptions, contributed to buildings, and so on. And there are records of that also, but it was not even noticed as, okay, women have done this. And so there is a history, there is a way in which even that skewed, um, biased set of, say, uh, but they were ignored. So it's a slow process, but very powerful moment came when the theoretical. I think we were very um, we were very what's the word for it? We were searching for our tools from anywhere, and I found myself shaped a lot by the writings of early historian of uh, early account of patriarchy from written by Gerda Lerner, for instance. I was uh, very influenced by that, and so my gendering caste is a late output which traces itself back to my study of an early paper that I wrote. That gendering caste as a text came out in 2004 or whatever it was, or but it was an early version of that was written in the early 1990s, and conceptualizing Brahmanical patriarchy, an essay that I wrote, which has circulated widely now because it does speak about caste and patriarchy together. That's something that was written early on, and I think I was very strongly influenced by the feminist turn to historical uh, understanding. And Kumkum Roy, for instance, a friend of mine, she wrote a very powerful book on the emergence of monarchy in early India. Unfortunately, it's so dense and so solid in its history that it's not widely read. But that was a very important uh, piece of writing. So we were struggling to find ways of writing history, which was not a compensatory history, which was not a history of this is what men were doing, this is what women are doing. You know, men carpenters, women carpenters. No, that's not the history that we should be doing. You know, gender is much more. Um, Gender is a much more solid uh, cat view of looking at the past. It can't be narrowed to men did this, women did this. That won't do. You know, it has. We have to be able to unravel historical processes from a gendered perspective. If you see what I mean, and that's something that it's taken us a long while to do. It's been easier to do for. I mean, I wrote Buddhism, the book on Buddhism, and then I went to Ramabai, the 19th century, because the sources in the 19th century were much better. And I could therefore write a history of a woman who is both subject to patriarchal society in her times, but is also challenging patriarchy through her writing. And I had to go to Maharashtra to do that, and I had to go to the 19th century. So my first book may have been on social dimensions of early Buddhism. My second book was on rewriting history. It was admittedly called Rewriting History, uh, the life and times of Pandita Ramabai. So, you know, it required us to make that leap from, so I have went from the age of Buddha to the 19th century, you know, and it was a required leap that I needed to do because the sources were stronger, better for me at that stage. And
Right.
that's, and a lot of people started to write at that time. Yeah.
Right. And I didn't think I would ask you this question because I know that you must have answered this like a million times. But because, you've written this book, Gendering Caste through a Feminist Lens, I would want to know specifically about the relationship between gender and caste in contemporary context, because when you wrote this book, it was probably seen as a part of how we, even understand intersectionality, which became a term later
Yeah.
conceptually, or like
Yeah. In fact, I never knew that term intersectionality.
right. So
But see, if you're doing gender, I don't think you can do gender by itself because you're talking about women. Women themselves can be disaggregated. But women themselves, if you look at it from the point of view of the framework, women are subject to power and the power of men, but particularly certain categories of men. So, you know, questions of caste and internal hierarchies, questions of class would also come in. In a sense, if you do gender, you're already doing intersectionality because you're disaggregating, you're challenging the paradigms that men have put into place in scholarship and so on for a very long period of time. So, in my sense, already we may not call it intersectionality when you do the gender turn comes to history, but the gender turn will force you to say, look, there's no one flat monolithic pattern. And there is a lot that's going on, and the history of men is not necessarily the history of women. And then automatically it will mean it's not the history of the underclass or the castes, the variation in the caste order, you know. And in the Indian context, that you're forced to be intersectional. You know, I never thought that I was intersectional. I still don't use the term intersectionality. But the fact of the matter is that you're you are facing uh, a monstrous use of power. It's not only men, not purely men or just simply men. It's some men who have had critical um, role in shaping the institutional apparatus which is governing us in India. Okay, so caste will automatically come in because caste is one of the most sustained uh, ways of stratifying society and one of the traps which is very difficult to get out of because if you're born into a caste and it is already so solid as a structure, uh, how do you actually challenge that structure? You have to take on the weight of the entire social forces in your society. It's not easy. It's not at all. And your marriage system, your uh, your gender is automatically implicated in it because your marriage system uh, is so set and is so structured that it'll, you know, gendering caste has a certain power because, unlike, say, for instance, the history of the US or England or even Southeast Asia, where you might have, or tribal society, a society which is homogeneous, you may not find the same linkages between caste and patriarchy that you find in the Indian subcontinent. The relationship between caste and patriarchy and marriage as an arranged phenomenon is a characteristic of South Asia. You don't find it in the same way, you know. At the end, I think in the same way. So I think was, and as far as I was concerned, again, it was the challenge of the streets that shaped me. I mean, it was that it was that poster held by the students of South Delhi Women's College, which said, "We don't want unemployed husbands." That was the trigger. And as I wrote in as part of the, I say this in my talks, VP Singh just gave the ordinance saying he was going to give OBCs, what's it called? There are going to be reservations for OBCs in the Indian administrative, in the central services. Yeah, that's all he said. That's the ordinance he did. He didn't say who should marry whom. Where's that ordinance coming from? That ordinance is coming from girls themselves when they say that our husbands' jobs are going to be taken over because those are the people we are going to marry, and they will have no jobs in the central services. I mean, what leads a woman to choose that structure? Because she knows that's where she's embedded, at the end of the day. And if she chooses to exit that, then there'll be violence against her also. So, in a sense, you faced politics of your time will be the trigger for the theory of your time, for the analysis of your time. We don't hang in the air as suspended creatures, we are shaped by social processes around us. So no scholar can sit in at least I can't. I don't think I was that kind of scholar who sat in a library and did all my work. I was out. And the women's movement ensured that you were out there. There's no way that you were going to sit over there and watch women being burnt and then say, okay, I'm going to sit and write in a library. That doesn't work, Feminists are automatically, I think, activists to some extent. So that's the time when, all of this starts to happen.
So, how does one strike a balance between academia and activism? Can academics be activists? This is also like one question that, we all have to struggle with and find answers to.
If you are responding to your times and you're living in your times and you're responding to the challenges of your times, then I don't think any academic will stay outside of that, any sensitive academic. There's no such thing as a laboratory atmosphere, as far as social sciences particularly are concerned. And for a sociologist, if you're doing field work, okay, now what field do you choose to go and study? The field will force you to write, because your field will tell you things that you were not aware of. That will actually shape the way you think and the way you analyze, because it's actually the ground that is throwing up the theory. It should. You can't go with a theoretical framework and say, okay, this is what I'm going to apply. And my data is going to fit. My field worker has to speak according to that. The laborer or the landlord or or the dominant caste fellow will have to speak in a certain kind of way. He will speak the way he will speak, okay? And she will also speak the way she will speak. But it's for you to then figure out the dynamics of power that's operating in that field. So the actually fieldwork is something that is um, hugely chastening. I can't catapult into a society with a set of assumptions that I have and then fit what people are saying into that framework. They will they will shape the way in which I write, because what they're saying is something that I'll have to disentangle and bring. So in a sense, I think fieldwork is automatically should be something that um, will turn you into more of an empiricist than simply a theoretician. Okay, but equally, it will also, if you and I don't believe in this nonsense of what's it called, uh, the untainted scholar who goes to the field in sociology and then doesn't uh, is supposed to stand there and simply neutrally observe everything that he says. Even the questions that she will ask will actually be, uh, mm, you know, will be um, grounded in a certain kind of way, which are reflective of the way you are thinking and the way in which the response is also given to you. So it's not hanging in the air. I mean, it's knowledge that is actually shaped from the ground because of the manner in which they speak to you and so on. So I'm actually quite convinced that um, that disciplines cannot actually put you into such neat little boxes, because society is not so neat. It's quite complicated, and the working of power is something that will hit you wherever you go. I mean, you may formally say I'm not an activist, but you will actually be faced with challenges which will bring you into the picture very strongly. Okay, and you will tend to uh, because why should human beings have to give up their own way of thinking and their own emotions when they go into the field? There's no reason why you should do that. There's no such thing as a neutral social scientist. It's only a hoax. So I don't believe in that. Everyone comes from somewhere, and it's best to put out these are my the shapers in my influence in my life, and this is what led me to uh, write the way I did. I mean, my gendering cast opens with that discussion of the mandala agitation. So it's best to put that right there. I was very, very strongly shaped by the mandala agitation in Delhi University, which was happening all around me. So um, uh, my response as a historian was to the history of my own time. And I don't think you can just be the social science. Medieval scholars could do that maybe, but I don't think that's a possibility in our times today.
Right, and thank you for that response, and I would also want to ask you, you've recent article on this as well, about the role of the state in protecting marginalized citizens and their rights, especially of women. Do you think that the state has impunity when it comes to violence?
Of course not. I don't think I will not grant impunity to anybody, absolutely anyone. The nation state in particular. I mean, what was the nation state supposed to achieve? It was we were we were bonded to. I mean, we were sort of bounded by a colonial power, and sort of forced to think and act in ways that were supposed to be, uh, which was certainly not part of the our our own organic way of being. I mean, why did we have to challenge colonial power? It's if that colonial power was not going to be uh, um, did it was freedom and unfreedom that led us to say, we don't want you, we want to govern ourselves. We have a right to govern ourselves. We don't have to be forced by a colonial power to live the lives that you dictate to us. Um, Now, you can't do that and then end up with the nation state, local nation states imposing unfreedoms upon people. I mean, freedom is a fundamental right of people. So, uh, so how can one actually allow the nation state to crush the aspirations of another set of people, or even the cultures? How can you have a Gangetic Valley view of society with its caste hierarchy and with its load of ideological baggage and all the rest of it? How can that be the code by which you're going to look at people? And if they are my people, supposed to be my people, they're entitled to the constitutional freedoms, they're entitled to the constitutional guarantees. And if those are not sufficient, I'd want the constitution to be enlarged rather than restricted or not inoperative. So at the end of the day, I think it's very important that we are living in our times, and we respond to the challenges of our time. Why should I say that I, as a woman born and brought up in Delhi, mostly um, first generation, literally first generation of the new nation state, independent India. I was 6 years old when we became independent. How can um, my understanding of freedom and subjection uh, not acknowledge that others have also their notions of freedom and subjection? And you can't put them artificially together and say, okay, now we are all within the boundaries, we are like this, and we will tell you what is to be done. But then, in what way are you an independent, free, sovereign people? If you feel yourself subject to to constricted ways of being and thinking, and inferiorization of groups of people and so on. So, at the end of the day, the state has no. How can the state be given impunity? How can any state be given impunity? You have to be answerable to the people. Your courts and your judiciary must stand guardians of people's freedoms, however low and distant they may be in the conglomerate of peoples in your society. So in your country. So it's uh, impunity. I mean, I will not. If I will not give impunity, grant impunity to the man to beat up his wife, okay, how am I going to give impunity to the state that's going to beat up its people? There's no way. There's no way I would do that. I would have to challenge it. I would have to challenge it. My own notion of freedom and emancipation and the right to be who I am uh, will challenge that notion of you are imposing upon me. That's not something that I'm going to do. And then to say, how can I grant any freedom to anybody to kill or murder or shoot or do anything like that, and say it's okay because uh, you know you have to grant impunity to the armed forces or this or that or the other. That's not something that any feminist can, any true, feminist can actually endorse or accept. So that's something that, yeah, of course, I would challenge that. What's my nation? I mean, and I have a commitment to my people, and my people includes all of this. This is my historical frame. This is my uh, uh, even as a someone sitting right here in Delhi with students coming from all over. I mean, how can I be the teacher of the upper caste Brahmin woman? That's ridiculous. That's an absolutely stupid uh, way of being. No, uh, uh, your relationship to your students is in a sense a microcosm of the way in which you look at your society and the inequalities within that society. So, yeah.
Last question. In the intro itself, we had this little discussion that you have made 9 films and the 10th is on the way. So, what prompted you to make documentary films in the first place? Do you see it as a tool that can capture certain experiences which, writing cannot?
Uh, See, I've been very deeply in the limitations. We began with the limitations of the archive. Okay. The women's movement, at least, as a feminist, I could see that large sections of women, large sections of people had been erased from history because the sources were biased. The archive was biased. Now, if I'm going to be inclusive, then, uh, and particularly inclusive for a gendered history, I would have to use any mechanism, any source, any way of doing history. Oral history became a very important part of my. Fortunately for us, we are living in times where we can record now and ensure that the history is not, if whether you get into the archive or not, you at least can represent the full range of uh, ways of being if you are if you actually generate and you are respond to what might be. You may not, everyone can write their own history, not everyone can get into the archive, okay, but there is such a thing as oral history, and oral history allows you to speak because your interaction, I as a scholar goes off to generate these interviews and engage with people, and their stories can then be brought into the framework of history via the cinematic approach, via the use of films. In fact, it was very much the archive, the limitations of the archive, that decided my took me in the direction of decisive turn to filmmaking. Came when I saw, when I was made aware of a very unusual archive of a woman who was on the fringes of the national movement, and who's not allowed to be more uh, uh, to participate in history, in the official history in a certain kind of way, because of the constraints of her family and structures and whatever it is. But she left behind a trunk full of paper, all sorts of jottings, little notes that she had made, records of various kinds, and so on. And when I saw that archive, I was absolutely transposed, because I thought to myself, well, I mean, here is this is kind of archival material that can tell its own story. Now, her granddaughter wrote her own this grandmother's account, but I could see the visual potential in that. And we ended up making a film on that. First film that I made was called A Quiet Little Entry. And the title itself came from a little one liner in her diary, which was very minimalist, in which she said, uh, sent money to the Mapla Fund. It's just a single line, okay? But she's responding to the politics of her time. And she sends money because she hears women and children are in distress. And she sends a small donation to the fund that was intervening uh, in the humanitarian aid that's to be given to the women and children who are in distress as part of the Mopla rebellion, as a consequence of the Mopla rebellion. Now, it's a single line, okay? But you could tell a whole story. At least I could visualize the unlived life of this woman, because she couldn't participate formally in the national movement much, because her husband was a colonial, colonial bureaucrat, okay? So she couldn't participate formally. But she continued to spin khaddar, and she wore khaddar all her life. And then she sent a large amount of money, which she had saved up from the kitchen money, for the salt agitation, the 1931 salt agitation. So, and there is a receipt for that. So it's a very episodic, fragmentary archive. Okay. But it's telling a story of the half lived or unlived or, uh, sort of trust, what's it called? Life of a woman who would like to be in the national movement but can't be. So history is as much about the oppressive structures that say that she can't. She's even a friend of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay is the heroine of the 1931 salt agitation. Subbalakshmi, who's her friend, simply make that donation and do an individual satyagraha. So, in a sense, and history will record one, but obviously leave out the other because they don't know of it. So, in a sense, the archive becoming a historian has to become an archivist if you are wanting to expand the pool of resources that are available for history. So then I made a series of films, and each of my films is about women. I only make films about women. And they get more and more political as we went along because my last few films are all about women who have been incarcerated for their political work. So they may or may not tell their stories, but I have tried to tell their stories cinematically in the form of documentaries. And these are unknown women. I have a girl from Massam, from Guwahati, who starts off with Nalbari. She's just a student, she's just a young girl, 10th class student. Uh, and she becomes uh, she's moved by the assassination of Parag Das, the leader of the mass Manav Adhikar Sangram Samiti. And when I did an interview with her, um, I asked her this question of how did you come into the movement, and she said when I was in class 10, Parag Das was assassinated, and then she started to cry. You can imagine the emotion of this girl who is reflecting on her 10th class uh, persona, uh, who was moved by the targeted killing of Parag Das, who's standing up for the rights of his people. And then she just becomes a full-time activist of the mass. And as part of that, she went to jail and so on. Now, this is who's going to be interested in her history, at the end of the day. But she's a protagonist in history. She too has lived her life. She too has fought back. She too has stood for values and for freedoms. So my films are filled with people of that kind whom you will not know anything about because they're not well-known people, you know. So it's my attempt at uh, telling the history of my own times, and I don't only have to write. I can also make films, and that's a way in which I can tell the history of my times.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And, this was a very, very enriching conversation. And I would like to thank you once again for taking time out when Delhi is freezing and you've been also unwell. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.